Once I had a crazy idea to reimagine how an American city could be improved in terms of urban planning using more sustainable approaches and to make a video about it. Like if I was the mayor, had the community support, some money to play with and a burning desire to make the city better. The main idea here is to show that American cities have a great potential and can totally hold their own when it comes to mobility, just like those in Europe. So I put this out there on my channel and got a lot of suggestions what city should I work with. Most of them were pretty big cities which felt a bit like biting off more than I could swallow, so I decided to look for something smaller. One of suggestions was the city of Meridian in Idaho, close to the city of Boise. It seemed just the right scale to me, so I decided to roll with it. So Boise is Idaho's capital and its largest city. It's got around 230,000 residents in the city itself and over 750,000 in its agglomeration. And it's one of my favorite city sizes because it's big enough to be interesting and have potential, but not too enormous to be uncomfortable to live in. It's kinda golden medium. The name Boise comes from the French word
Boise,
which means wooded. Located in Treasure Valley, surrounded by mountains, it's got some pretty nice scenery, so there is definitely a lot of places to go for a weekend. To make you understand how serious it is, just look at this. Oh my god. These beauties are a few hours away from Boise by car on a picturesque mountain road. In general, this part of the United States isn't densely populated. The closest big cities to Boise are Salt Lake City, which is about 500 kilometers southeast, and Portland, which is like 550 kilometers the other way. At the same time, the city is developing quite rapidly in recent years, and people from neighboring states, including California, are increasingly moving here. Between 2010 and 2020, the city's population grew by 30,000 or 14.5%, which is quite a lot. Of course, that's bringing up real estate prices and making traffic worse, and not everyone in Boise is thrilled about that. And now let's take a closer look. In the city center, as you might expect, you've got this downtown area with all these tall buildings that you see in every panoramic shot of the city. And it looks especially good with the mountains at the background. Actually, everything looks better with the mountains in the background. But once you get up closer, you'll notice there are not so many skyscrapers, and most of the downtown is filled with single-story buildings, warehouses, or just parking lots. Although, as I said, the city has been actively changing in recent years, and right now some new buildings are also appearing in some of these neighborhoods. The same named Boise River flows through the city, and it's very cool that almost the entire length of its embankment have been transformed into green areas, parks, and other places where residents can have a rest. And all these green areas are united in a green belt connected by pedestrian and bicycle paths. But once you step outside the downtown, you are in classic American suburbia, which is gradually blends into neighboring cities like Meridian and the rest of the agglomeration. As for urban mobility, Boise's got a public transport system with buses. There are a total of 24 routes, but the local carrier only has around 50 buses and they serve about 900,000 passengers annually. The frequency of buses on many routes is up to an hour and some don't operate on weekends, which is of course a very sad situation that needs to be improved if we don't want the city to drown in traffic jams. But more on that later. By the way, in 2016, Boise quite seriously discussed the construction of a circular tram line in the city center, the cost of which was estimated at $200 million. This was advocated by then-mayor of the city, Dave Bitter, who, in my opinion, quite reasonably believed that the performance of tracks has a greater economic development potential for the city in a way that rubber tire projects have not in the past. But in the next elections, residents selected another candidate as a mayor who was no longer such a Tram fan, and the idea was abandoned. There is also a rail line connecting Boise to Seattle and Salt Lake City. The first transcontinental train traveled along it in 1925, and at the same time the Boise train station was built by New York architects Carrier, Hastings, Shreve and Lamb, whose the most famous project is the Empire State Building. It's still considered one of the most beautiful buildings in the city, but it's no longer used as a train station. In the 1960s, people began to use trains less and less, and the railway began to decline. The last passenger train left Boise in 1997, and now the restored building is used mainly as an event hall. And by the way, this postcard view of the city opens from its terrace. Besides, Boise also has an airport with flights to more than 20 US cities and is one of the bases of Alaska Airlines. And as we started talking about the history, let's see how the city used to look in the past and how it changed. The city of Boise was founded in 1864 due to the discovery of gold and silver mines in the area. The gold rush in California had already declined then, and the mines in the Boise River Valley became a new point of attraction for gold miners. The new settlers often clashed with each other. The situation was generally quite tense and sometimes even resulted in massacres. So to keep things under control, a military fort was built at the intersection of the main roads around which the new town grew. By the way, it is interesting that now history is somewhat repeating itself, and the Boise River Valley has once again become a magnet for people moving from California. This is how 8th Street looked like at the intersection with Idaho Street at the beginning of 20th century. I love the style of these brick buildings, but unfortunately they haven't survived to these days. And by the way, the population of the city was only about 6,000 people back then. And now this place looks like this. The image of the city was completely destroyed, and that looks really sad. As we can see at this old photo from Main and 9th Streets, Boise used to have a tram. And this is what the place looks like now. The tram is gone, but some buildings have been preserved, although there is a little less decoration on their facades. Streetcars were introduced in Boise in 1890, and in 1912 the system became electric and interurban. The wagons traveled a large 70-mile circle connecting all the main cities of the agglomeration, and they transported not only passengers but also the goods of local farmers between communities. But later the tram company began to have financial difficulties, and the system was closed in 1928. Here is another old photo of Main Street from a different angle and a current view of the same place. This is also Main Street in 1937. Such photos can be looked at endlessly, exploring various details such as street lamps, signs, building elements, cars, and lots of other things. By the way, this photo shows how active the street life was, because as you can see, almost every building has a shop or some other facility on the ground floor. And here is the current view of the same place. Only the theater building on the corner has been preserved from the old picture, but everything else has changed completely. For example, in one of the downtown blocks in the 1930s there was such a gorgeous building, but then it was demolished and only this gate left. And now there is a quite typical glass high-rise building at the plot. Classic. Okay, let's take a short break from my commentating and just look at the pictures. And a few words should be also said about the city of Meridian, which is located right next to Boise. This story will be quite short though. Meridian is a classic American suburbia, almost entirely built up with single-family homes. At the same time, the city's population is 125,000, which is more than, for example, such cities as Caen in France, Lucerne in Switzerland, or Bergamo in Italy. The city is divided by Stroads into identical squares of exactly 1 mile by 1 mile dimensions, within which the layout of local streets is rather chaotic with a large number of cul-de-sacs. This planning is entirely oriented for private car mobility and makes development of public transport and bicycle infrastructure very problematic. However, we will try to fix this. At the very beginning of work on this video, I've contacted the person who suggested the city of Boise as a topic, and she was so excited that even recorded for me a street walk video. So here are some of the best moments from it. So in the first part of this video we got to know the city of Boise, how it appeared and developed, what it looks like and what challenges it faces. And now let's move forward and let me tell you my ideas of how we could improve it. The main principles I think should be implemented are the density and diversity of development, public transportation as well as pedestrian and bicycle friendliness. In general, Boise really needs efficient and attractive public transport that will connect the city center with its agglomeration and become an alternative to daily private car commuting. And along with this, the city should be made much more pedestrian and bicycle friendly. And the last one is especially important in the context of Boise because due to the low density of housing, it will be quite difficult to provide the entire city with a public transport, so bicycles are crucial for solving the last mile problem. So we need not only high quality public transport but also its interaction with the bicycles, electric scooters and so on. Then, for example, it will be possible to ride a bike or a scooter to a public transport stop and then use it to get to the downtown. Of course, for this purpose, all streets in suburbia must have a protected bicycle infrastructure that will make such commuting convenient and safe. Moreover, to make the city more balanced, we should reduce the need for daily pendulum migration and create subcenters with the jobs along public transport corridors, which will fully comply with the principles of transit-oriented development. Then residents of Meridian and other agglomeration cities will be able to find or organize work close to their homes and get there without a car. Of course, this is not about banning anyone from driving, but about creating a convenient alternative and the ability to choose from different options. And now let's talk about all this in detail. Nowadays, most of the jobs in Boise agglomeration are located in the center, and most people commute from Meridian and other cities to the downtown every day. Of course, they drive, which creates traffic and a great demand for parking spaces. At the same time, in the city center, quite a few blocks are occupied by one-story buildings with various businesses, but there are relatively few housing units. In my opinion, this situation should be gradually changed and the center should be built up with more multifunctional neighborhoods, which would include both housing and business facilities. Most of these developments should be 4 to 5 floors high with a little bit of high-rise landmarks, but not too many of them. And each tall building shouldn't be just a big box, but should have an interesting modern architecture that would enhance the city's skyline. There are quite a lot of examples of such developments in the world, and I like, for example, such new districts in Stockholm, Malmö, Lyon and Vienna. So I mean, this should be gradually replaced by something like this. It is important to make sure that the center is not only a place to work but also a comfortable place to live, and that the city center is filled with people not only during the day but also in the evening. Among the ideas that can be borrowed from the world, I am also quite inspired by the planning of Barcelona, where each block has chamfered corners, which creates a small square at each intersection. A slightly different approach can be seen in Buenos Aires, where such cuts are made only on the first floors of the buildings, and this gives more space for pedestrians at the sidewalk and at the same time more usable space in the building itself. Also, looking at the city plan, I really miss the big central square where could be held Christmas markets and other public events. So I'd suggest not to build up 1 or maybe even 2 blocks and give them to public space and greenery. Cause the green belt is good, of course, but it would be nice to have more green spaces right in the middle of the city so that people could sit on a bench in the shade of a trees during their lunch break. I mean, for example, like in Latin American cities, where there is almost always a large green square in the center with a monument to some famous local guy. And now let's talk about mobility. As I said before, it is crucial to create more diverse options for people's commuting, so that as many points as possible can be reached not only by a car, but also by other modes. And for this we will need efficient public transport and a safe and extensive bicycle infrastructure. By the way, if we check out Strava heat map, we can clearly see that cycling in Boise is quite active and there is definitely a demand for a good cycling infrastructure. The current 50 buses that runs once an hour and don't work on weekends are they are just useless. Of course, we will need buses too, but for an 800,000 agglomeration, this is clearly not enough and we need something more solid. I will not suggest the subway even in this fanfiction video, but a modern tram would be very appropriate. And by modern, I mean multi-section wagons on dedicated lanes and with full priority at intersections. As I've mentioned before, they wanted to build a streetcar line in Boise, but it was supposed to be a loop around the downtown, so maybe it's a good thing that it wasn't built. This time we will do something different. Now it should be a really trunk line that will bring people from the outskirts to the center in the most direct way possible. I think we should start with two lines like this. The first one connects Meridian along Fairview Avenue to downtown Boise, and then it can be extended all the way to Barber Park, and the total length of this line is about 30 kilometers. The second line goes from Star City also to downtown Boise, where it intersects with the first line, then goes past the old train station and has another terminus near the airport. The distance between stops in the city center should be between 400 and 600 meters, and in the suburbs we follow the street network and make stops at intersections, so the distance between them will range from 8 to 1600 meters. Of course, this is already quite a long distance, but we have to take into account the great length of our lines and make sure that the average speed is high enough to make our trams attractive to passengers. It is also important to make trams run frequently enough, at least every 5 minutes at peak hours, so we'll need a lot of them. As I said, in the center these lines meet each other, and for a small section they share a common corridor where you can transfer between them. For example, you can come from Meridian using the first line, transfer to the second line and go to the airport. Here I also made a loop around the center, but this is not for a separate line, but rather to provide detour options and not to stop the entire system because of traffic accidents, as it happens, for example, in Salt Lake City. And now let's talk about street transformation more in detail. For example, this is what Main Street in downtown Boise looks like now. It has 4 asphalt lanes, one of which is a dedicated bus lane and the rest are for private cars. There is no bicycle infrastructure on it, although even on Google Panoramas we can see several parked bicycles. And this is how the same place could look like in my vision. Now there is a tram line here, and the tram has 2 lanes and runs on a dedicated right-of-way covered with grass or succulents. Between the tram tracks and the sidewalk we made a 2-way bicycle lane 3 meters wide, and on the opposite side a lane for car traffic and parking spaces between the trees. The tram tracks are physically separated from the car lane, which, in combination with priority at intersections, will make tram traffic as smooth as possible. And the same goes for cycling. The distance between building facades here is relatively small, so I was unable to make bike lanes on both sides of the street, because then you get too narrow sidewalks or you can't make sufficient protection of a tram line, and both those cases are not very good. So this is kind of a compromise solution, but it also has its own advantage because a bike lane of this width can be also used by emergency vehicles. And this video from the Netherlands shows that if necessary, a fire truck can easily pass through such a lane, and it is much easier for cyclists to clear the road than for car drivers. On streets without the tram traffic, depending on the situation, we can already make bicycle lanes on both sides of the street, or like here, only on one side but a wider one. But in any case, it should be physically separated from cars. Here you can see the place where the tracks divide and where the trams of the first and second lines meet each other, and this tram, for example, is just coming from the airport. From time to time there should be a tram stops, and then we have to make a small pedestrian zones around them. There is not enough space for a car lane here, so cars have to make a detour around the block, while trams and bicycles go straight through. We make the platforms almost the length of the entire block, so that we can run the longest possible tram cars. In fact, the size of a downtown blocks is what limits the maximum length of our trams. That means we can operate trams up to 70 meters long, and with this length it will be a system of two multi-sectional wagons with a total capacity around 600 passengers. So the general principles in the city center are this: the tram runs as straight as possible, there is always a protected bike lane on the street, there is a maximum of one car lane parallel to the tram, and where there is a tram stop, cars go around the block. Another important topic is the suburban streets. In fact, these are not real streets, but rather as Stroads with a bunch of car lanes, narrow sidewalks, and nothing else. Oh wait, there is also convenient and safe bicycle infrastructure, which of course anyone can use without a fear of being hit by a car. For example, let's take this part of Fairview Avenue. We already have insane 9 lanes here, so we should be able to fit everything we need. So on the street axis we make 2 tram tracks with the platforms, and on the edges wide 2-way bicycle lanes, and separate them from the car lanes with the green areas with trees. And after that we have a space for 2 car lanes in each direction. Now cyclists will not ride among fast cars risking their lives, but in a much safer and more pleasant environment. And we are making the bike lanes on both sides 2-way, so that cyclists can always go in both directions without crossing the street. Near the tram stops we also arrange bicycle parkings where you can leave your bike and take a tram to the downtown. But besides this, it should also be possible to transport a bicycle on a tram. At the intersections, bike lanes are also separated from cars by green zones, and in fact we have a classic Dutch intersection. Side streets also have separated bike lanes, and in addition a central divider with trees, which makes the street safer and simply more attractive. At the tram stops we make large roofs that protects passengers from the weather as much as possible. The platforms are separated from the car lanes by a low concrete barrier, which will prevent cars from flying into the platform in case of an accident. There are also quite a few plots next to the proposed tram line where we could build a mixed-use development that would become a new neighborhood center. It could include housing, offices, cafes, shops, and many other things. Of course, the shape of these blocks here is notional, just to show the general idea. Another street I worked on is Capitol Boulevard, which leads from the Capitol to the south. And by the way, that's the street you can see in this classic city angle. Right now there is also a lot of car lanes and nothing else, and this is how it could change. Near the crossing of 9th Street and Sherwood we make a tram stop for the second tram line, which goes to the airport. A bike lane comes from downtown in parallel with the tram line and goes through the green zone, where we make a zigzag to preserve the trees as much as possible. Then the tram tracks go to the street axis and later enter the square near the old train station, where the tram makes one more stop, and this is very important because the railway should become another important element of urban mobility. As I've mentioned before, there is a rail line runs through the city. It is currently not used for passenger transportation, but this should be fixed and suburban connections should be restored to more distant cities that cannot be reached by tram. I counted almost 200 kilometers of a possible 2-way route that would pass through Mountain Home, Boise, Meridian, Nampa, Caldwell, Nissa, Ontario City, not state, and pay it. And if we could manage to run trains on it at half an hour headways, it would be great. Then, for example, one could get to the airport, let's say from Caldwell, not only by car, but also by train to the station, and then a few stops by tram. All of this is done on schedule and without the risk of getting stuck in a traffic jam. Of course, in our imaginary ideal world, the railway will be electrified and the trains will be something like veg toddlers in California. In general, I feel that if all mentioned in this video is done, Boise will become a much more comfortable and sustainable city. Of course, this process is significantly complicated by the low housing density in suburban areas, and to change this situation we need to change land use and transform the neighborhoods into more diverse and multifunctional ones. But the situation is definitely not hopeless. Such improvements require a lot of investments and time, and besides, changes in approaches to urban planning. And this last one is perhaps the most important and at the same time the most difficult. So, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I was while making these visualizations. And by the way, if you want more videos like this one, please let me know in the comments. And I would also like to thank Tiffany Oakes, who initially suggested Meridian and Boise as a topic for this video and then helped a lot with its preparation by advices and filming.